Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. I'm Professor Bob Long. I'm going to be covering bone tissue today. This is a continuation of our bone lectures. For those of you that are enrolled in my class, you'll be following along in the note set. We're going to be on page 41. If you're not in my class, then you need to be following the outline or the PowerPoints or whatever your instructor prints out and gives to you, or however you take notes. I have had a number of students message me and say, I don't go to Del Mar, but I'd love to get a copy of your note set. I write and publish the note set for my students to take their notes in. It's sold in our local bookstores. They're about $15. I don't make anything off it. Any money that I charge as a handling fee or for the production of it goes into a scholarship to help students. We have a foundation at Del Mar College that takes money for scholarships, so I don't profit off my students that way. They pay me to do a job here. So if you want to purchase one, look up Student Bookstore, Corpus Christi, Texas. Call them, ask them if they'll ship you one. I'm sure they'll sell you one. They're like $15 plus whatever shipping and handling is. I try to keep it real cheap. Anyway, so if you're in my class, we're going to be following along. We're going to be continuing our bone discussion. We're going to start on page 41 of the note set. One of the things that will be important for us to review and understand is this. There are different types of cells found in bone tissue. Those cells have different functions. Most of the cells are actually related to each other, but there's one group of cells that are completely unrelated. And this is at the table that's on the top of page 41. One of the cells we're going to look at is called an osteoprogenitor. So let me start that over. One of the cells listed is called an osteoprogenitor. And if you look at the name, osteo always means bone, pro can mean before, and genitor means to make, or one who makes, like to generate, okay? So osteoprogenitor cells are cells before they're making bone yet. And so one of the things we know about these is these are called stem, and sometimes we use the term mesenchyme. They're mesenchymal cells. Mesenchyme means embryonic tissue. So these are stem cells or mesenchymal cells or embryonic cells, okay? They're undeveloped. Okay. They are usually found in the periosteum, and I'm going to put endosteum in parentheses because they can be found there. And they usually will develop into osteoblasts. Now, one of the things I try to get across to people, because sometimes people don't understand this, or at least no one's ever explained it. If I take a person, if I take two different people, and I have them grow up in different areas of the country or different parts of the world. For example, if one person were to grow up, let's say in Rome, near the, growing up near the Vatican, what's the likelihood this person's going to speak Italian and maybe learn some Latin and become a Catholic? Let's say I have another person that grows up in, Israel, near what's the word I'm looking for? The temple. Well, what's the likelihood this person's going to speak Hebrew and end up possibly being Jewish? Or let's say I take a third person and they grow up near, let's say they grow up somewhere else in the Middle East, like Iraq. What's the likelihood that they're going to grow up with a Muslim influence and they're going to speak a totally different language? So, where we grow up very often influences how we develop, okay? Now, the same is true for cells. If these represented cells, and one of them was growing in a tissue near bone, what's the likelihood this cell is going to grow up to be influenced by all the chemicals in the surrounding tissues to develop into a bone cell? If this one is located somewhere near the dermis, what's the likelihood that this is going to be an epithelial cell? And if this one is growing up, let's say, somewhere in the brain or the spinal cord, what's the likelihood this one's going to receive the chemical influences to become a neuron? So, when I talk about stem cells, that would be like taking a brand new baby It can be anything. It might grow up with certain beliefs, certain religions, certain attitudes, certain behaviors. That is going to, what behaviors and how they behave and think and feel and act is going to be dependent upon the areas surrounding them that influence them, their family, the neighborhood, and all of that. Well, the same is true with cells. If I take stem cells and I stick one in the periosteum of bone, since it's so close to the bone tissue, what's the likelihood it's going to be influenced by bone tissue to become a bone cell? So, since these cells live in the periosteum, very often they receive the chemical influences to grow up to become an osteoblast. So when I look at an osteoblast, we've already talked about this term blast. This is an immature bone cell. We know that they are mitotic. We know that they can build the bone tissue or build the bony matrix. We're going to talk about the matrix of bone in great detail. Okay? So osteoprogenitors grow up to become osteoblasts. Osteoblasts grow up to become osteocytes. These are mature bone cells. They are usually non-mitotic. They stop growing by mitosis. They are trapped in a lacuna. And they can maintain the matrix. Okay? So, osteoprogenitors are embryonic cells. Many of them are still found in the periosteum of bone, and they haven't completely developed into bone tissue. Very often they'll call these adult stem cells because they exist in the adult body. Osteoblasts, osteoprogenitors, if they migrate out of the periosteum into the bone tissue, then they will morph into osteoblasts and start building the bone tissue and dividing rapidly by mitosis, and they build a lot of bone matrix. As they lay down the bony matrix around themselves, if they get trapped in a lacuna, they become osteocytes. They're fully mature, they're stuck in the bone forever, they're non-mitotic, they can maintain the matrix that surrounds them, but they don't go build large chunks of bone tissue. Now I'm going to draw a line here because there's a totally unrelated cell. It's not related to these cells, and we've talked about these before, also called osteoclasts. So you're seeing those suffixes that we talked about in tissues. Osteoclasts are not, well, let's just describe them. They're very large, multinucleate leukocytes. They're a white blood cell. They're a modified white blood cell that just lives in the bone tissue. And when we do their genetic analysis, it turns out they're related to immune cells, white blood cells, not actual bone cells. And one of the things that we know is that they can secrete acids and enzymes to digest bone matrix. They can destroy the bone matrix. They puke out a lot of acids and enzymes, and it eats away the bone tissue. As it digests that bony matrix, it releases some of the calcium salts that are trapped in the bone. One of the things that happens is this. These cells right here play a major role in bone healing. Not all tissues heal very well, but when you fracture a bone, we will grow bone across the fracture. Even if the bones aren't lined up, they can heal in a misaligned form because the bone tissue will heal. When we first break the bones on the edge of the fracture lose blood supply and die, and the tissue is all damaged and messed up. Look, if a storm blows through and knocks a window out, you might be able to replace the window. That would be like being an osteocyte. But if a major storm blows through and you come home from traveling to avoid the storm and there's nothing but some, beams sticking up and maybe the front steps, what's the point in trying to fix it? Why not just bulldoze it all down and remove everything and then have a building crew come in and rebuild the tissue? Osteoclasts are that destroyer crew that comes in and just wipes out all the damaged stuff, and then osteoprogenitors can convert into osteoblasts, move into the tissue, and rebuild it when we're doing bone healing. Okay? So these cells can digest bone matrix for two reasons. One, to release calcium salts if we're not eating enough calcium, and two, to remove damaged and dying bone tissue so that we can move osteoblasts in and heal it. So you should know these populations of cells. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about what's called hydroxyapatite, which is the matrix of bone. So I'm going to erase a lot of this material. And we will ask you about these cells. Your instructors are required to kind of ask certain questions. So sometimes I have students tell me, Mr. Long, what are some things that I could use to help me learn the A&P if I'm struggling? You know, there's books that are called like Anatomy and Physiology for Dummies, The Idiot's Guide to A&P, Anatomy and Physiology Made Incredibly Simple, the Physiology Coloring Book. It's one of my all-time favorites. Let me just show it to you. The Physiology Coloring Book. There's an anatomy coloring book, but the Physiology Coloring Book cuts all the physiology down. If you guys need help, buy those books. One of the things you do is when you go through those review chapters and you go through the questions that are at the end of your chapter reviews, you notice that if 4 books have a lot of the same questions, guess who's got to ask that question? We do too. That's the basic fundamental information. We will get into more detail, but at least that sets the foundation for you. We have to ask about those cells. Now, hydroxyapatite. Hydroxyapatite is part of our bone matrix. Okay? It's a scientific term for the bone matrix. The matrix of bone has 2 parts. There's an organic part. The organic part of the bone matrix is all the protein fibers. If you think about it, we had a lot of the same protein fibers in connective tissue proper, elastic fibers and collagen fibers. And then we had elastic cartilage. So cartilage can have elastic fibers, and we had fibrocartilage which had collagen fibers in it. So cartilages are just a little bit further evolved type of connective tissue. So is bone. When we look in bone tissue, what we're going to see is we're going to see elastic fibers and collagen fibers growing throughout the bone tissue like this. And then we pack all these calcium salts around that. If you've ever seen someone building a sidewalk and they lay that little mesh wire down like this, and then they pour the cement over it, what that mesh wire does is it provides some flexibility. Without the wire, if the cement dries, it will crack and separate. And you see that in sidewalks where it's separated, where roots grow underneath, or the land moves and the sidewalks crack and separate. But when there's this reinforced steel bar or rebar, then when I try to move it, it might crack, but it doesn't separate. It just cracks and holds together. It provides some flexibility so that the tissue doesn't just simply fracture apart. And in order for bone to have a healthy hydroxyapatite, you have to have protein. You got to have protein in your diet to build and replace these proteins all the time. And then there's the inorganic part. And the inorganic part is all the calcium salts packed onto the proteins. So that's what makes the bone very solid. The inorganic part, all the calcium salts, are like pouring the cement. Without the cement, we have a flexible screen, and if you stepped on it, it would flex and bend. Without the calcium salts, our bones would simply be collagen fibers and be very flexible like the dermis of your skin. But when I build the calcium salts on there, it loses that softness and elasticity. It becomes very rigid and hard. But the fibers do prevent it from separating. So the organic part of hydroxyapatite is the protein fibers. The inorganic part of the bone matrix is all the calcium salts. Calcium carbonate, calcium phosphate, calcium chloride, calcium hydroxide, a whole bunch of different calcium salts. And literally, like cement, it's like powdery, and we mix it with certain chemicals and it hardens like cement would. Well, that's kind of how we form bone. Okay? So you should know the hydroxyapatite, you should know the organic and inorganic part. Finally, in this lesson, I want to talk about one last thing, and it is a wedge-shaped cutout of a piece of long bone. And this is going to get rather complex, but remember, when we had a long bone, let's say we're looking at the ends of the femur like this, okay, and I cut across it. If I were to look down here, you know we have the marrow cavity, and we have compact bone. We have a little bit of spongy bone lining the walls. And this is from a previous drawing from another lesson, but we would have the membrane called the periosteum on the outside, and we have a membrane lining the inside called the endosteum, and then we would fill all of this with bone marrow, okay? Now, if I were to cut across this and look down on it, what I would see is, I would see this. I would see a ring of periosteum. I would see a wall of compact bone, and then I would see a little ridges of spongy bone on the inside. If you're curious, the next time you go to a grocery store, go to the butcher and say, can I have a single O-bone or O-bone steak? Super cheap. And then take a look at it and you'll see there would be meat muscled out here, and then you would have the compact bone, the spongy bone, and the marrow cavity here. And if you got it with flesh still on it, then you would see the periosteum and the endosteum. Usually those protein fibers wither away and rot away, and you're just left with the bone tissue. And then I would have the marrow cavity. Now, imagine if I tried to cut this like I was cutting a piece of pie, and I looked at it. I would have out here what we call compact bone, or what we also call cortical bone. And it would be a rather thick wall growing around like this. Right on the inner edge, I would have the strex or trabeculae, and they would not be this thick compared to that. But right here, I would have my spongy bone, also called cancellous bone. Okay. I would have a membrane on the outside out here called the periosteum, and I would have an endosteum on the inside. Now, before I get to that, if I were to look under a microscope at the trabeculae of the spongy bone, and I were to look at the end of them, I would notice they're growing like little tubes that crisscross like this. And if I were to look at one of those little tubes, it would also look like the rings of spongy bone that I see in here. I see that the spongy bone grows in these things that look like a bunch of rings that are bumping into each other. If I were to look at one of these rings of bone and draw it larger, it's called an osteon. An osteon is also called an Herversian system, after a Dr. Herversian who first described them. But an osteon is also called an Herversian system. If I were to magnify that, it would look like this. In the very middle, there's a couple of blood vessels here. And then what happens is this. These cells called osteoblasts, I'm going to use a different color for them so that we can kind of see this. But some cells called osteoblasts would start to make a little ring around these blood vessels. Remember, the only way that our cells get any nutrients, carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, to grow and divide and build tissues is through our blood supply, okay? So now, let me make sure I'm not too far off the screen. Yeah, I'm good. So, what will happen is, these little cells will grow these little extensions of cytoplasm. They'll reach out and grow these little growths that are going to connect to these blood vessels. And as they do that, they will get all the nutrients and all the calcium salts to build the collagen and all the hydroxyapatite. And what they end up doing is they build a big ring of bone around themselves, and each one of them gets trapped in a lacuna. Now, I'm not going to do this everywhere. I just want to give you an example. But this bone tissue would be solid calcium salts all the way around, and even in between these little membrane extensions that are growing in here. So they completely surround themselves in calcium salts all the way around. Once they're trapped in a lacuna, each cell would be called osteocytes in lacuna, or we'll put lacunae for plural. Now, after a while, another layer of osteocytes will start to grow around this. And in order for them to get their nutrients, they're going to grow some extensions of their cytoplasm into the next ring of these other osteocytes like this. I'm not going to do it all the way around, but you get the idea. And then the process repeats itself, and they'll lay down another ring of bone. And then they'll do it again and again. So when you look at the models or you look at the slides, what you see is you see a bunch of little cells, and you'll see some little lines running out this way. And in the very middle of each osteon will be the blood vessels. Now, the blood vessels are located in a space. I'm going to try to label this without getting too messy. These vessels are in a space called the central canal. Now you have to remember, we're not just drawing a ring. These rings would be growing in 3 dimensions. So these osteons are literally like the pencils growing along the length of the diaphysis here. And I'm looking down on top of this edge, and I'm seeing the tops of these pencils. Imagine if you took some matte pencils and you see the color inside with the wood around it. The color in the middle would be the central canal, and then the layers of wood around it would be the osteon. Now, within the osteon, we have these osteocytes trapped in lacunae within the matrix of bone, and the little legs or canals that extend out this are called canaliculi, which means little canal or little canals. Canaliculus would be a small canal. Canaliculi would be multiple. So those little canaliculi are the little lines growing in towards the central canal that connect each osteon or each osteocyte to each other and to the central canal for their nutrition. Well, if I look at it, each layer or ring of the osteon, I'm going to put a little asterisk here because I'm running out of room, but each ring of the osteon is called a concentric lamella. Con means with, central means middle. So within the center of one circle is another circle. And the term lamella means layers, like when you laminate something. So if I draw circles like this, these are called concentric circles. Well, since I have multiple layers here, they're called concentric lamellae. So when I look at the compact bone, I have all these osteons. Each one has a central canal with concentric lamellae of bone growing around it. And then within each lamella, there are osteocytes trapped in lacunae, and they are all connected to each other into the central canal by canaliculi. If I were to look at the edge of one of these trabeculae, it would look like that. It's an osteon growing in a particular direction. Now, there's a membrane that surrounds the outside of the bone here, that goes around the outside, and that membrane is called the periosteum. And then I would have a membrane that would be hugging the inside of the bone tissue, called the endosteum. And I hope you can see that this would be this wall. This space, the marrow cavity, would be here, and then the muscle tissue would be out here around the periosteum. It turns out that both the periosteum and the endosteum have 2 layers. So if I were to look at the periosteum, if I were to cut this periosteum, I just switched the color on accident, but that's okay. If I were to cut a piece of the periosteum and look at it, then if I have bone tissue here, the periosteum is made up of 2 layers. The inner layer is called the cellular layer. The reason it's called the cellular layer is because embedded in it are a bunch of cells called osteoprogenitors and osteoblasts. That's where they live. The second layer of the periosteum is called the fibrous layer. That fibrous layer is very fibrous. It's a lot of dense connective tissue that makes it very strong. If you ever get to be a surgical tech and do bone surgery, you'll have to scrape the periosteum off of the bone. There's also some blood vessels and nerves growing in here, so when we break a bone and tear the periosteum, that's where all the pain comes from. Okay. Well, if I had the endosteum in here, the inner layer of the endosteum is also called the cellular layer, and the outer layer of the endosteum is also called the fibrous layer. So I would have spongy bone here. So these two membranes actually have two layers. The inner layer is always cellular. The outer layer is always the fibrous or connective tissue layer. That makes it strong and tough. If I were to fracture this bone tissue, then some of those cells could migrate in and heal the bone. Finally, a little bit of information I need to give you. As we're growing, our bones are tiny when we're babies. When we get bigger, the diameter of the bone will get larger. And one of the ways that that happens is that the inner cellular layer will have cells that migrate out, and they'll actually lay down another ring of bone all the way around the outside edge, and that will push the periosteum out. And I can lay down several rings all the way out here. Now, mind you, I got all of these osteons in here, but these outer layers of bone tissue would be growing just underneath the periosteum. And those outer layers of bone are called circumferential lamellae. It's getting really hard to write at the bottom of the board. And with these cameras, I can't get the big board like I normally have, so it's making it difficult on me. But the term is circumferential. Let me rewrite it a little bit bigger. But each one of these layers would be called a circum, from the word circle, ferential. And by the way, you should be looking up all these terms in your textbook and following along in the textbook. But the circumferential lamellae are the layers of bone tissue that grow around the diaphysis just deep to the periosteum of bone. Finally, if I look inside the tissue, I'm going to use green for this one. Every now and then, between some of these other pieces of bone, I see some lines that look like an old osteon. And we call those growing layers of old osteons. You're seeing the circumferential lamellae from an old osteon, but we really call those interstitial lamellae. Man, my picture's probably looking pretty ragged or pretty crowded now. Let me take a look at it. Well, you can see it. So, and again, read about all of this in the textbook. There's a beautiful picture of this in the textbook. You need to find that and understand it. But the interstitial lamellae are the remains of old osteons that are being eaten away. So let me explain one last thing and we'll wrap this video up. When it comes to our bone tissue, when we look at a bone in lab, we think that they're very static. It forms and that's it. Bones are constantly remodeling. Imagine if you go around your house and you rip out sheetrock and you replace it and paint it. It looks exactly like the old sheetrock. And then you rip out another section and you go all the way around a room. And then you keep going all the way around the room. Anyone who walks in who looks at the room and goes, it looks like the room has always looked. But it might be completely new materials that look exactly like the old stuff. Well, that's what's happening in bone. The compact bone is and so is the spongy bone, it's very dynamic. Let's say you haven't exercised in a while and you decide to start go rollerblading. As you rollerblade, you might feel muscles and soreness in areas you haven't felt in a long time. Well, when we stress bones continually, Mother Nature knows if I'm going to continue to stress that part of the bone, I better thicken that part of bone. And so some osteoblasts can go in here and they can start to eat away one of these old osteons, and we can start to have new blood vessels grow in, and we can start to form a new osteon, and we see the remains of the old one, which would be the interstitial lamellae. And if this osteon got bigger, we would eat away here, and you might add another layer to this osteon. So osteons are constantly growing and declining. We're constantly removing bone and replacing it and remodeling it, and the evidence of the remodeling is these interstitial lamellae, the remains of old osteons where bone is remodeling. Okay. Anyway, we're going to wrap it up there because this is a pretty, convoluted picture. There's a lot of stuff going on. Please learn this material. Know the different cells found in bone. Know the two major components in hydroxyapatite. What is the organic and the inorganic part? And then be able to draw this bone wedge model and label all the parts. What is the central canal? What are circumferential lamellae? The osteocytes trapped in each layer help form it. The canaliculi are the membrane extensions that connect the osteocytes to each other and to the central canal. The interstitial lamellae are the remains of old osteons being removed as we grow bone and reshape the bone for new stresses. And then the circumferential lamellae are those lamellae that go around the circumference or the outer ring of bone so that we can increase bone diameter. We also have the periosteum and the endosteum. Both have an inner fibrous layer, an inner cellular layer and an outer fibrous layer. The cellular layer is where the osteoblasts and osteoprogenitors live. The fibrous layer just makes it tough and strong. So, you should know all of this information. Please read your chapter. Please be able to draw this, practice it, do it till you can't stand it, do it till you understand it, do it till you can teach it to someone else without looking at your notes. I hope you had as much fun as I did. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.